After that, we got a whispered from them, they got us. And that was when we knew. And then, of course, the lights all went on, and Baldwin was reporting, police cars and everything like that. And we knew that they had been apprehended. So Hunt and I took as much of the gear as we could, and we took all the stuff we could, and we walked down, walked out, walked past the police, got in our cars and left. I went home. My wife woke up when I went into the bedroom, and I said something like, things didn't go well today. I think I'm going to have to go to jail. And I got in bed and went to sleep.
Wow.
All right.
Yeah, I've never seen Fear Factor. Is that Fear Factor?
That's Fear Factor.
I've never seen it in my life. I don't even know when it was on.
Early '80s, back when Joe Rogan had hair.
I don't remember him ever being on TV. I have no knowledge of him other than he's kind of like the G Gordon Liddy of his era in a lot of ways.
Kind of
physical and a talk show host.
Mm-hmm. I thought that fit pretty well.
What the hell was that? He was in a diving bell or something?
Yeah, they put him in a pressure chamber, and then the sound conditions, and whoever can hang out in there, and they're all like, "Oh my God, the sounds and stuff," and he's just sitting there like, "Whatever."
Wow,
it's a picnic.
Wow. Yeah, for him, anything's a picnic. I mean, I remember going into an isolation tank, and once you get used to it, it's kind of.
He was on news radio too. That's right, Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
With Phil Hartman and them.
Oh, Phil Hartman, right. Yeah, I mean, what a bizarre situation for him. Wow. Yeah, I mean, because when he gets out of jail, he becomes like a second act of celebrity.
Yeah, I know, all over the place. I found that, I was like,
there's so much footage of him. It's amazing. I mean, never mind. I was just talking about the radio show that, he was doing that radio show where he's Rush Limbaugh. For 10 years on the radio or longer. I don't even know how long he ran. I was listening to it the other day from the 90s. Very entertaining, Eric.
Yeah, the dude had a lot of depth, multiple lives.
Multiple acts to that story. Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the William F. Buckley firing line interview, he's kind of like a mental midget compared to Buckley. He could barely have a conversation with him back then. Very introverted, quiet, doesn't understand the questions from Buckley, who is intentionally being a dick. As William F. Buckley was with his brain, torturing this guy over his morality.
Which is funny. Well, I mean, I don't know. I guess as we hear the story, maybe he went through some things, Mark, and that might have changed him over time. And
oh, you mean in prison or in general? Holy crap!
I mean, period. It's like, wow.
It's one of the weirdest stories. I mean, we've done a lot of weird stories, but I don't know if, as an American individual, rugged individual, separate story, and I don't know if he's a hero or a villain. I mean, and it switches too. I mean, the people who thought he was a villain when he came out later heroized him, and the people who were on his side turned on him, and then he was a hero at the beginning because he was. I mean, it's just he goes back and forth, Eric. He goes back and forth. I mean, it's just a hero to some, then a villain to the same people, and then vice versa.
He seemed to be his own man.
Right. I mean, his wife stood by him. His kids stood by him. His kids became full military careers. I don't know what they're doing now, but his kids are very successful, put it this way. They didn't turn to drugs and alcohol like many celebrity kids. These kids were very successful. I think he had four boys and a girl or something.
Which is quite remarkable. So let's see. We're talking, of course, about this guy.
Oh, yeah, but we're going to go back further than that guy because that's pretty far into his life already. I mean, it starts out in Hoboken, New Jersey, where he is a totally emaciated, sickly child who's raised in an oxygen tent.
Wow.
Yeah, who has to wear these mentholated chest patches because he can't breathe. He's got asthma. He's got all kinds of viral chest infections. He can't go out. He's sickly. So when he comes out of the oxygen tent to go, this is in Hoboken, right? And he decides to go in the other direction eventually. But at first, he's afraid of all of these things. He fears fire, pain, heights. He's afraid of heights. He's afraid of electricity. And these are not, and rats and lightning. The list, this is by his own list. This is his list as a kid, because he keeps a journal, and he decides to take on all of his fears one by one. And I'm leaving out the biggest fear that he has, which is the oddest one of them all: Zeppelins.
Zeppelins?
He fears Zeppelins, right? Because the Zeppelin that lands in Lakehurst, New Jersey, is right by his house. So when he's playing outside, he describes it, coming in for a landing at Lakehurst all the time from Germany, from Europe, and it completely fills the entire sky, and it's literally 50 feet off the ground by the time it passes his house. And it's so terrifying to him, the sound and the fact that it obliterates the sun and the sky and complete eclipse of everything. And he sees the bottom of the basket all the time, where the people are. And he doesn't really know what this is because he's like 5 years old.
That makes sense.
I'm just telling you what he said, completely terrifying to him. And then something happens which magnifies it even more.
I'm here. I'm on tenterhooks. Let's go.
The explosion at Lakehurst, New Jersey, of the Hindenburg.
Oh, wow.
Right. And all of his fears come true because that's what he feared, and then it happens.
And he saw it? He's a witness?
He's there. He's not at the field, but I mean, it's happening all around his town. You know what I mean? And he now fears lightning, and I don't know how he overcomes Zeppelins. That one I don't understand how he overcomes. But he with fire, he literally lifts up. Let me just start with lightning. I'll start with lightning. He climbs up a tree, the highest tree in his near his house, and he straps himself with belts to the highest branches he could possibly find in the middle of a lightning storm, while thunder is going all around him and lightning is happening, and he wants to get over the fear of lightning, so he stays strapped in the tippy top of a tree during the entire lightning storm. Okay, that's how he overcomes lightning. Then he's afraid of rats, right? So his cat, or his sister's cat, one or the other, brings home a dead rat. So he takes the rat and he cooks it. He makes a little charcoal outside with a circle of rocks, starts a little fire with twigs, cooks the rat, and eats it in the backyard. This is at like 7. This is at 7. That's why that picture you showed of him at the FBI is way down the road, my friend, of this guy's life. He then goes down to the Hoboken docks with his friends, where they are attacked or confronted by like 4-foot wharf rats that he has to overcome the fear of giant wharf rats that are underneath the pier. They're playing around on the ships there. Their game as kids is to jump on the bottom of these freighters, a completely dangerous situation for 8 and 9-year-old kids. They're playing on the docked freighters surrounded by wharf rats, Eric. And dude, so he's got to overcome, and he stands up to one, and like, I guess he makes himself bigger and starts yelling at it, get away. You know what I mean? So he somehow overcomes his fear of wharf rats. Now the lightning is done, the fire is done. He that's where he starts getting into burning himself with a candle and doing that stuff that he talked about on some of the interviews. That's done at an early age. So he's sticking his finger into the socket at home to feel what electricity feels like, to overcome the pain of possibly going to the electric chair. But it's a weird household. The father is a lawyer. They're totally wealthy. They moved to West Caldwell, New Jersey. They have a maid. This is not even a middle-class family at this point. His father is a huge lawyer, and his father is very strict. He's the manager of the Little League team. Gordon is involved in all kinds of different sports because of his dad, and his dad is brutal, but incredibly successful as a lawyer. So he demands all this stuff of him, and he comes home. I don't even know how to explain this. He gets the maid is German, and she's listening to Hitler and Goebbels on the radio every day, and he falls in love with Hitler on the radio. Every day he comes home and listens to Hitler, and he says, it sent electricity through my body, how great the Fuhrer was in his broadcasts. And the father comes home, he says, if I ever catch you listening to Hitler again, I'll beat the living shit out of you. So of course he says, oh no, I'll never do it again. But, like many kids, he's enamored. Now this is 1933, 35 Hitler, you know what I mean? And we're not in World War II yet, but it's
right.
The same kind of thing happens as our other stories, like with the Black Tom Island and that whole thing. You begin to feel that we're going to go to war. And the maid is sympathetic to Hitler, and she listens to Goebbels and Hitler on the radio every day. And there's a big Germanic population, as some people know, in that region of New Jersey at that time. There was Hitler Youth. There was a lot of stuff going on in that area of New Jersey. And even to this day, there's a lot of German descendants living in that area of New Jersey. So he has friends who are German and blah, blah, blah. So he's listening to these stories on the radio and trying to learn German, and he gets enamored with the Germans. That's all I can tell you. And the reason I'm mentioning this is going to be pervasive through his entire life, Eric. This Germanic Nazi love affair. Okay, we go to war. He's only like 12 or 13. So he's praying that the war lasts long enough for him to get in it, right? Because he's like 14 and he's going, oh, please don't let it be a short war, God. Please let them fight for 6 more years. And this is what he's praying for. And then when the Nazis surrender, he starts praying for the Japanese to keep fighting. And he says, but goddamn Truman drops an A-bomb, thereby defeating my entire chance of getting into the war, which is kind of a funny sidelight. But
wow. No, there were people like that. I mean, in that time. I mean, it was considered the heroic thing to be in a war. I mean, their parents were in World War One and Civil War, grandparents.
Right. So his father fires the maid because she's okay. I don't know how to explain this. They're getting propaganda mailed to them from the German embassy in New York to the house for her. And now he's reading Nazi propaganda. They're on the mailing list, the house address for this prominent attorney who's his dad, Eric. So he finally fires her, hires a bunch of different maids, and ends up with a maid, and I forget her name, Teresa, I think it was, who is literally a Jewish woman who fled the Nazis. And it completely reverses a lot of what he was thinking, but not completely. Because he does, at first, he doesn't want to eat the food that she cooked, and he doesn't care that she's Jewish, but she kind of, eventually he realizes that she escaped the Nazis, or so he says, but this will come back later on. So anyway, so he goes to college and he goes to Fordham Law School. I think his father had gone there. He goes to high school and he learns. He's not huge, Eric. I mean, he's not a big guy, but he learns how to defend himself with all kinds of martial arts. But even as a teenager or like a 12-year-old, he wants his dad to get him a gun, and his dad won't give him a gun. And every kid in New Jersey has a gun. So the best he could do is get a BB gun out of his dad, right? So that's not good enough. So he decides to build his own gun from scratch. The guy, he figures out how to take parts from the BB gun and glom on some other crap and build some kind of a, actual gun. And he goes out, starts shooting squirrels, killing squirrels. His mother sees him kill a squirrel. The squirrel hangs on by its nails to the branch and then drops to its death. And the mother goes, that's the cruelest thing I've ever seen. And he starts crying, and he runs into his room realizing he's killed a squirrel for no reason. And it's some kind of a lesson where he says, I'm not going to kill anything for no reason unless I'm ordered to kill it, But anyway, he misses the war is the point of the story, but he still becomes a Marine. And the war that he gets involved in is the Korean War, 5 years later. And he goes through boot camp, and he ends up, it's like, I want to say it was in El Paso was where his boot camp was, Eric.
Could be.
There was Fort something or other in El Paso. It's still there. Whatever that fort is, maybe people in the chat know what that is.
Bliss?
Yes, Fort Bliss. Absolutely. Thank you. So he gets into a as things will have it, a sit-up contest with the other boys who can do the most sit-ups. So he wins all these things. He wins the sit-up contest. And a couple of days later, he's ill, and his friend says, oh, you're obviously bit by a tarantula. And he goes, I don't remember being bit by a tarantula. And the guy goes, don't tell me. I know tarantula bites when I see one, right? So there's no marking on him. And he's taken to the base medical camp where it's determined he was not bit by a tarantula, but he blew out his appendix during the sit-up contest. Doing so many sit-ups, now they have to do emergency appendectomy surgery on him, and he can't go to fight in the Korean War.
Oh my God.
Now he's totally embittered. So they send him to an anti-aircraft battery that he's going to run, whether it's an 88, I don't know what it is, but it's a huge anti-aircraft battery. And he figures, okay, this is not a bad job. Unfortunately, the anti-aircraft battery is on Cropsey Avenue in downtown Brooklyn, where he is the last line of defense if Soviet bombers attack Brooklyn. So they give him this job with sandbags, Eric, with sandbags during the Korean War in case the Soviets decide to attack Brooklyn or the East Coast, as a matter of fact. So he's really embittered by this, right?
Oh my God.
I'm telling you, there's a lot to this story. So he gets out of this thing, and in 19, I don't know, 52 or 3, he decides to join the FBI. And that's where you're starting to see that photo up there. He goes from the military to the FBI and goes to basic training at Quantico. Yeah, that's him when he graduates. And he already knows quite a bit from the military about weaponry and everything else. He says, but the FBI would prefer that you know nothing about weapons so they could train you from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
They don't really like to have guys who say, yeah, I dag nabbit. Come on, Bobby, learn how to shoot. Come on, Bobby. They don't really like that guy. So they begin to teach him from scratch how to shoot. And this is really amazing. He explains in detail how you have to look at a target with a revolver, right? With your right hand, shoot 5 bullets. This is in the training. You shoot 5 rounds into the target, flip out the cylinder, Eric, right? Which we learned from the Baldwin thing. Reach into your pocket, empty the spent cartridges, reach into your pocket where there's 50 live rounds in your pocket. Pull out 5, reload the 5, close the cylinder, switch hands, and empty 5 rounds into that same target. This is the drill that you have to master. Okay, so he does this. Everything I just described, he becomes the best guy they've ever had do it at 11.74 seconds. Everything I just described to you was done in 11.74 seconds.
Impressive.
Right. And he begins to learn how to shoot a machine gun. I mean, they take you through the whole thing. But he's sworn in, I think, in July 1957 as an FBI agent, and he's sent to the West. He's sent to Kansas or somewhere out west, Gary, Indiana, somewhere out there. And then eventually he's sent to another city, and he begins to be the guy who kicks down doors and does all these things. He wants to be the guy on the front line.
He was like HRT before they had HRT.
What is HRT?
Hostage Rescue Team.
Right, exactly. Right. Okay. So he wants to be the guy, not so much about hostages. I don't think they had that much back then, but they did have fugitive felons that were running around the country. And that was his game, to take down a fugitive felon that was on the 10 most wanted list of the FBI. That was all he cared about. And they could be in Kansas, they could be in Gary, Indiana, wherever they were. So he would go to like their mother's house, right? And or wife when they were on the lam, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he said this was what they call black bag jobs in the FBI. And he didn't invent it, but he did it, right? And you would break into their house illegally, 1957, 58, and go through the mail of the mother or notes or whatever is there to see if you can get a lead on where the guy is, Eric. Okay. This will come into play later in Watergate. So he didn't come up with this. He said this was what the FBI did under Hoover. You know what I mean? And so he's already breaking the law in 1957. They have no compunction. And this is not about civil rights. This is not about Watergate. This is just breaking the freaking law to get guys who they want to apprehend. You know,
this is pre-Miranda, for God's sake. So yeah,
right. That's right. Because he mentions Miranda at one point. 1962, he resigns from the FBI, and he resigns from the FBI. They don't want him to resign, right? He meets with Hoover. He goes into Hoover's office, and he thinks he's going to get promoted because the amount of money he's being paid is not enough for him to support his 5-person family and a wife and kids and everything else. Right. So his dad, keep in mind, has a lot of money, but he's not taking any money from his dad. That's what he's trying to support. So he goes into Hoover, and he thinks he's going to be in there for 5 minutes meeting with Hoover, right? Mm-hmm. And Hoover, for reasons that nobody can understand, at the peak of his power, goes on for 45 minutes how he hates Eleanor Roosevelt's guts. And he goes into a diatribe about how in the 40s he used to have to call FDR on the phone and go, "Your wife's undermining national security, sir. You got to do something about it." And FDR would say, "All right, I'll take care of that." And then he'd take his wife and tell her that she was doing something that was so communistically red that Hoover is now calling him. So he tells all this for reasons that Liddy has no idea why. And he's just listening to J. Edgar Hoover for 45 minutes, tell him about how much he hates or hated. I mean, this is, 1956, so let's say 55. So he really reveres Hoover, Eric. He really does, because he's, going after commies. He's fighting the Reds. He has an uncle. Liddy has an uncle. And that uncle was involved in the killing of John Dillinger at the theater in Kansas City. The uncle.
Oh, wow.
And the uncle comes over the house. The uncle is why he joins the FBI, not his dad. The uncle, he picks up his uncle's super automatic 38 and is running around the house with it. And the uncle takes it away and gets him a toy version of it as an early age, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the influence. And his uncle is kind of a legend in the FBI. And his uncle tells him, there are FBI agents, and then there are bureaucrats in the FBI. And the bureaucrats in the FBI are not agents. They are jealous of the agents, and they undermine the agents and try to brown nose Hoover all the time. And he gives these examples of how this is eventually going to affect the FBI. And he's correct. He says these bureaucrats will do things like, just weird things. They'll bring Hoover a birthday cake and sing happy birthday to him every year. In other words, they're brown nosers.
Sure.
They're administrative deep state origin of the administrative state, Eric.
Yeah, political. They're just political in there.
Right. Okay, so these guys are there, and his uncle warns him about this, and he realizes he's not making enough money. So, despite his success at the FBI, he turns in his resignation in September 1962. And what does he do? He goes to work for his father. And he's a lawyer, and his father's a patent attorney, and his father's super wealthy. They live in the suburbs of New Jersey. And he says, I got to make some money for my family.
Yeah, makes sense. He had enough of them.
He had nothing. Not that the FBI did anything to him. In fact, it was quite the opposite. He was very successful in the FBI. He just realized there wasn't room for total growth. He was never going to be Hoover. And there were also guys below Hoover who were waiting in line since 1932, to be Hoover. You know what I mean? So
they would have thought of him as a knuckle dragger too. If he was a badass and a good shooter and a door kicker,
right?
The same brown nosers would hate his guts.
They hated his guts for that, but he was also a well-read intellectual, which is going to come into play later with the president of the United States. So in January 1966, he quits working for his dad. He works for 4 years using his skills as a lawyer for his dad, and his dad puts down the mortgage on a house. They get a house in Poughkeepsie where he meets his wife, and she is a complete Mensa level genius working for IBM, who codes, or whatever the variation of coding was back in those days for IBM. And she's the brainiac who is putting IBM all through the country in terms of computer technology. That's his wife. Wow. Who's like 5'10" and gorgeous, of Teutonic descent. Now, the reason I mentioned Teutonic descent is that Liddy, throughout his life, talks in Germanic Nazi phraseology. It never goes away. And it's all no. And this is pervasive. And I'm going to tell you why as we get into the Nixon administration, because he has this fixation, and a lot of people did. I remember growing up where there was a lot of right-wing people who they revered the structure of the military of the Germans. Remember this, Eric, when you were growing up? There were guys who just said, yeah, man, the Germans are unbelievable, man. They could kill anybody. You know what I mean? That whole revering of the German military and Hitler, it wasn't so much political as it was a respect for your enemy that we defeated.
Like Rommel.
Rommel.
Amazing general. The better tanks.
Right. It was that kind of stuff. It wasn't about the Jews. It was about military, if that differentiates it, and blah, blah, blah. But he was into Nietzsche. He was into Germanic. He was Goebbels, obviously, as I mentioned. And anyway, so in 1966, they get the house in Poughkeepsie, and he moves to Poughkeepsie, and he goes back into law enforcement because he has a law degree as the assistant district attorney in Dutchess County. And that's where he begins his law enforcement outside the FBI career as a prosecutor, Eric. Now, this is yet another phase of the Liddy legacy, which nobody knows about. So what does he do in Dutchess County? He tries cases. They had a rule in Dutchess County: if you indict, you try the case. You know what I mean? Unlike DAs today, they never see inside of a courtroom, right?
Right.
Okay. In Dutchess County, where I lived for a number of years, if you indict or you're the guy bringing charges, you're going to end up in that courtroom. So I'll give you an example of a Liddy case, right? He's the defense, and he knows these guys, a small town and stuff in Poughkeepsie, which only had a small amount of people living there at the time. There was a case where the defense said the gun in the shooting, the murder in the shooting, the gun was broken, Eric. Right? This sounds like some similar case. Right. So Liddy says this gun's not broken. The jury's sitting there, and they don't know anything about gun technology. And as he's doing his summation to the jury, he takes the gun that's the murder weapon in the case, which is empty, and he puts in a live dummy round. He palms the gun, and he secretly puts in a blank into the cylinder of the gun. And as he's doing this, he's explaining to the jury how a gun works, like something that Seth Kenney would do. right?
Sure.
So he's just saying this whole soliloquy. And he says, watch my trigger finger now. And he slowly points the gun at the ceiling in the courtroom. And he slowly, ever so slowly, dramatically begins to pull the trigger on the gun as he's talking. And he's saying, watch how this so-called broken gun still functions. And he's going, here's the hammer. Here's the trigger. This is the cylinder. Just like the Baldwin stuff, right? And he slowly pulls the trigger and boom.
That'll get your attention. That would scare the bejesus out of the jury.
The old lady who was juror number 12 jumped out of her seat. Everybody did. Her handbag goes up in the air. The judge goes, Liddy, you son of a bitch, who was a friend of his, the judge, right? The
Good thing.
Said, what?
Good thing.
Right. No, he's a friend. And the judge yelled, Liddy, you son of a bitch. And he wins the case, right? Because of this. Anyway, he would do stuff like he would take an axe, bring it into the courtroom, start chopping up wood. This is what his MO was. Okay. So he hears about this group that was down in Millbrook, which is southern Dutchess County, at the Hitchcock Estate. And the Hitchcock Estate was a giant mansion with a lot of land down by the Hudson River. And he hears about these naked people running around down there, all kinds of weirdos. And he says, we got to take care of this. The people are complaining down there in Millbrook, Liddy. So he goes down there and they're hiding in the bushes. And they've got all kinds of men down there. And it's the raid on Timothy Leary's estate. And they arrest all these people. But the description of the arrest as they go into the house to take down Timothy Leary is unbelievable because there's a lot of cops involved. It's the sheriff's department being led by Liddy, who always carries a .357 Magnum, by the way. I mean, he's Dirty Harry before there's Dirty Harry, Eric. He goes in, leads the way. They're hiding behind the bushes, waiting for a signal to go in. And all of a sudden, out of the other bush, a naked girl starts running, being chased by a naked man, having nothing to do with their raid. And he goes, dear God, what are we getting into here, Liddy? Right? So they go to bust the door down, but they don't have to because it's wide open. And they look in and they go, they're watching some movies, Liddy. And he goes, what kind of movies? Porno? He goes, I don't know. And they look through the window and it's the whole group is in the living room on acid watching a movie of a waterfall. So they're transfixed. There's a screen and they're watching a movie of a waterfall. And he's going, oh, dear God, this isn't going to work. Because what they wanted legally, there was something like 35 rooms in the mansion, like 30 bedrooms. And they had to catch them in each of their rooms, Eric, to make it legally stick. In other words, if it's a drug bust, you can't just be in the living room because they're going to say, that's not mine. You know what I mean? You can't be in a group. It's not going to hold. And Liddy knows this. The reason Liddy is putting all these spots is he's a lawyer an FBI agent who knows the law. And he says, we got to get them in their rooms. This is a mess, right? So they, try to tell them to go back to their rooms. They kick open a door and the guy goes, freeze. And it's a guy in mid-thrust naked with another girl on the bed. And the guy goes, you got to be kidding me, bro. So they begin to peel these people off naked in different stages of undress, whatever. And he has a lot of them arrested. But Leary and his wife just go batshit. Leary's wife goes crazy screaming at them. And not Leary. Leary's very calm about it. And he said, I'm going to call the ACLU. This is never going to stick. But his arch nemesis becomes Timothy Leary. And later on, years later, they will tour together and become best friends. But he later, at this time, he felt Liddy was the most dangerous man in America. Leary was the most dangerous man in America, thought Liddy. And he would pursue him in southern Dutchess County for years. Now, he's also not done with two other places that we're going to mention. One is Vassar College, which was in Poughkeepsie. And Vassar College, he shows up at the gatehouse with a long line of police vehicles. And the guard at the gatehouse says, what is this all about? and he says, I'm going in to bust the entire college. And he goes, really? He goes, let me notify the dean. This sounds important. So the guard, wakes up the dean, a woman, it's a woman's school, and says, there's a man here, G Gordon Liddy, says he's going to have a drug raid on the entire campus, ma'am. And she says, what? And she gets on the phone to another guy who gets the phone call rerouted to the gatehouse. And that guy is Nelson Rockefeller. And he starts screaming at Liddy, saying, you jackass, turn this caravan around and go back to where you came from. So Liddy turns the 50-car procession around, and they go back to the sheriff's station. And it says on the front page of the Beacon paper, maybe the Poughkeepsie Journal, I forget what the name of the paper was, Liddy foiled in drug bust of Vassar, right? So, okay, cut to a month later. Liddy says, I got to do the same thing at Bard College, which is up the road where I went to school. So he shows up at a place called the Whaleback Inn, which is right on Route 9 across the street from the college. It's like a lobster Italian restaurant, pretty fancy. Like if your parents were visiting you, they would take you to dinner at the Whaleback Inn. You know what I mean? If they were visiting, it's a fancy place. Sure. My mother never did that. She just mailed me a salami. And I don't think they ever came up there once, my parents. But anyway, so in the Whaleback Inn, all of the state troopers assemble for the drug bust of Bard College. And they've got police dogs in there. So Liddy wants coverage. So he notified the local TV, newspapers, and radio stations that this time he was going to bust Bard College. And they say, okay, great. So they go ahead to the campus where they set up their cameras on tripods in front of the dormitories. And these kids go, this is like 5 a.m. These kids go, what's going on? And they go, I'm a huge drug bust. This is going to be great. So all the kids come out in their bathrobes and they're standing outside with the news crew. And in comes Liddy with the dogs and the men and everything and guns drawn into the dorms. There's nobody in there. There's no drugs. And the front page paper says, Liddy foiled again in drug bust, right? So there's kind of a buffoonery about Liddy's attempts, Eric.
Wow.
To do this stuff. But there's two favorite Liddy stories. One, I'll tell you right now, he has a girl on the payroll. Liddy's stories at Bard were legendary. Okay, just so you know, if you know the band Steely Dan, right? Mm-hmm. Walter Becker and Donald Fagen. They were, I don't think Becker was, but Fagen was arrested in a later drug bust by Liddy, or at least he claims it was Liddy, but it really wasn't. So, yeah, this is coming up in a year, but I'm going to that's 1966. That's April 6, 1968. I'm sorry, I take that back. That's going to be in a year. But Liddy has a girl who is a heroin addict as an informer on his payroll, right? As assistant DA. And he takes her down the road to this bar that we used to drink at called Adolph's. And he's in her car. And he says to the girl, inside the bar is a notorious heroin dealer. I want you to go in there, seduce the guy, get back in this car with him, take him to your house, go in, cop heroin, let me out of the trunk. I'm going to hide in the trunk of this car. And let me out when you get there, and then I will come in and bust him, and that will let you off the hook, and I won't bother you again. So she says, all right. So he gets out of her car. This is G Gordon Liddy. Nobody knows this. This is really just personal Liddy stories that I've had for a long time. So Liddy gets into the trunk of her car. The girl, terrified of Liddy, goes into the bar, Adolph's, where I used to drink, and many of us did, which had a pump outside that had a handle that was stolen, that was referenced in Subterranean Homesick Blues by Bob Dylan, which said you can't use the pump because the vandals stole the handle. That pump was right outside the bar. But that's another story for another day, because his future wife, Sarah, went to Bard College, and he would visit her. And that's where Ballad of a Thin Man came from, and Bobby Jones, and a whole different story. But for this story, Liddy goes into the trunk of the car. She goes into the bar. She stays in there, digs the guy, goes home in the guy's car, sleeps over, and Liddy is stuck in the trunk of the car overnight. So the next morning, the media shows up with the state troopers who are photographed prying open the trunk of the car with crowbars And there's G Gordon Liddy in the trunk of the car, and the headline, Liddy foiled again in drug bust at Bard. That's the headline. Okay. That will lead to 1968, April 6th, where Bard College is raided successfully by Liddy, and 44 people are arrested, which is that headline that I found the other day in the archives. I can't believe I found this. This is from the Poughkeepsie Journal, I believe. And that was a vindication for Liddy of pulling this off. Now, Becker and Fagan claimed that they were arrested, but that was 1969, and Liddy was already gone from Dutchess County at that point. So I don't know what happened, but they wrote My Old School, which was a huge hit for them, Eric, as Steely Dan. And that was about never going back to my old school and referencing G. Gordon Liddy in the song. That's why Steely Dan and the song is linked together. Now, you say, well, how did they get the name Steely Dan? That was a pretty big band. The weird name of Steely Dan, again, having nothing to do with the story, was a steam-powered dildo from William Burroughs' book Naked Lunch. Just for anybody at home who's curious about it.
I knew it was some kind of sex toy or something. I didn't know exactly what.
Steam-powered in Naked Lunch.
Yeah, well, we know what Burroughs is doing while he's writing the book.
Right. So anyway, Becker and Fagan will later become huge rock stars. And they had a drummer. They were in a band together at Bard. I think it was called Leather Canary. I take that back. Leather Canary, before they had Steely Dan. And the drummer, Walter Becker was a guitar player. Fagan was on keyboard and sang. And the drummer was an obscure guy named Chevy Chase, who will later go on to some fame in some other field. I'm not really sure what happened to him. But anyway, there was some stuff going on there, and Liddy was in the middle of this. So he runs for Congress as a Republican on a ticket in 1968 after this bust, and he's running against Hamilton Fish for Congress. Hamilton Fish is an old family in New York. In fact, they had a spin-off cousin named Albert Fish, the Moon Maniac, who cooked an 8-year-old Grace Budd in his oven, who became one of the leading serial killers in New York State. He was also a Fish. They don't talk about him that much, but he's part of my mass murderer trading card.
Fish and Keene helped inspire Norman Bates, if I recall.
Right.
They were part of that.
Right. That is true. But I have a special mass murderer baseball card on Albert Fish. And that was Hamilton Fish's cousin who ran against Liddy in that election. And Liddy, I think it was a 51-49 split. That whole region of upstate New York was really conservative Republican at the time. And now it's purplish, even to this day. I think that's, even now, it's kind of conservative to this day. But anyway, Liddy loses, but attracts the attention of people in Washington because he begins to campaign in upstate New York for a new presidential candidate named Richard Milhouse Nixon.
Okay.
If you get how they get connected. And he begins to come under their radar, and they put him in the Treasury Department as an agent of the Treasury Department, Eric, a drug agent. And he says that the Treasury Department at that time was riddled with CIA people and all kinds of intelligence agents. And the Treasury Department would print up phony ID for the CIA, Eric, as we pointed out in some other episodes involving Dealey Plaza.
Of course.
So he goes to the Treasury Department and he begins to work for Nixon, and he gets involved in writing a memo to his overseer is Jeb Magruder, and there's different people up the ladder, the chain of command, but his overseer is a guy named Jeb Magruder. He writes a memo, I think it's in 1971, that he believes that J. Edgar Hoover should be replaced now. This is really interesting because Hoover is at the end of his career. And Liddy writes a long, erudite memo to the President of the United States about him replacing J. Edgar Hoover now before the election so it doesn't get politicized and look bad that Nixon was putting in his own guy, if you follow what I'm saying. And Liddy compares it to a president appointing a new Supreme Court judge before an election, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And all the fighting, the infighting, and he walks in this memo, which is fascinating. He puts the pros and cons of when to get rid of Hoover. And he says you could do it after the election, you could do it before the election. And he votes to do it before the election, Liddy. And he explains the internal stuff I was telling you about that are the problems at the FBI, how it's completely depressed, how Hoover is now gone megalomaniacally insane. In the memo, he says all this. He says Hoover's lost his mind. Clyde Tolson is he doesn't say that they're lovers, but he says he's the second in command. It's top heavy. They can't get anything done. These bureaucrats are running the bureau. The agents can't wait to get out. And indeed, he cites his own example of leaving himself, of lack of advancement in 1962. And he says, I recommend the president do it now rather than later. But Nixon reads the memo and says, this is the greatest memo I've ever read, just as a memo. And he writes A+ on it.
Great.
It's like a red pen. And it gets shuttled back down the chain of command through John Mitchell, through all these guys, Charles Colson, through Jeb Magruder, back to Liddy, and through John Dean. And he says, look, we don't know how you did this, but the president's in love with you, right? And that's how Liddy makes his bones and gets involved in this mess that we're now going to get into. Because Liddy writes the memo to get rid of J. Edgar Hoover. Now, J. Edgar Hoover kind of gets rid of himself because in May 1972, he dies, right?
Yeah.
Right. But again, that creates a problem, Eric, because now it's going to be a war. Tolson takes over briefly, and they bring in a guy who is second in command, L. Patrick Gray, who becomes involved and enmeshed and knows these guys. And if he would have listened to Liddy and replaced him with his own guy in 1971, he may not have gotten into the trouble he's about to get into with the FBI, Eric. And we're going to get into that right now because, I mean, in a way, like, you know, he was kind of like Joe Friday, right? So, but in 1970, 71, he's already an experienced guy. And they bring him in and he realizes, according to Liddy, that it's not unlike today, but it's like today on steroids. He believes we're in the middle of a civil war. He believes that these bombings by the Weather Underground, which are thousands and thousands of bombings, that hundreds of cities are on fire. Liddy believes that all rules have been suspended. This is his personal belief. He believes this is a civil war. And he quotes Mark Rudd at one point as his explanation. I remember he quoted Mark Rudd of the Weather Underground, Eric, that this was a war. And this allows Liddy to justify every single thing he does. If I could find this quote, hold on a second. I just want to find this thing. Oh, here it is. Okay. Oh, wow. Check this out. Is this the quote? No, that's not the quote. That's not the quote. That's not the quote. Hold on. Oh, here's a quote by Mark Rudd. And this justifies to Liddy. This is in Flint, Michigan, by the Weatherman. He says, this is from Mark Rudd. We have to start tearing down this effing country. We have to have a revolution in this country that's going to overthrow, like bombs, like guns, like fire bombs, by anything and everything. The most important thing that the weather machine should be right now is to create a consciousness, a political consciousness. And the best way to create this is by doing and performing some kind of exemplary action, like offing some pigs, creating chaos in the streets, blowing up pig stations, blowing up banks. Once the weather machine begins this and starts the ball rolling, then the weather machine will not have to be involved as much. Other white revolutionaries are going to get involved and tried to destroy the system that we all hate so much. Now, think about it from Liddy's point of view. You fought in the war, you're FBI, you've been a DA in Dutchess County, you've been involved in this thing, and now the world around you, the country that you love, is now completely on fire, being blown up by the weathermen all over the country, Eric, right?
Mm-hmm.
He justifies this, saying all bets are off, and begins to form a dirty tricks unit that we now come to know as the Plumbers unit in Watergate lineage. That's where the Plumbers unit comes from. And he begins to create a program called Operation Gemstone. Now, Operation Gemstone is the program of all the dirty tricks involved that Liddy comes in to pitch to John Mitchell, who has left the Attorney General's office and is now running CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President.
And who the hell came up with that name? I mean,
they didn't even realize it. They didn't even realize how stupid it was. So, okay, let me just tell you parts. He comes in with these huge charts into the former Attorney General's office, and Dean is there, and Jeb Magruder is there, and they have egged him on with a massive offer of a huge budget to do this. Liddy just didn't come up with this himself. Dean and Magruder, Jeb Magruder, tell him that this is going to be well received and money's no option, right? So he comes up with all these different minerals as part of Operation Gemstone. And he talks again in Nazi terminology to Mitchell. Okay, just to back up for a second, just to show you how deeply enmeshed he is in German culture, he goes to the National Archives to have a movie night at the National Archives, brings his kids. And what are they screening? Triumph of the Will by Leni Riefenstahl, the Nazi filmmaker. He then puts together a private screening for Nixon and the others in the film room at the White House of Triumph of the Will by Leni Riefenstahl. This is not some harebrained scheme that Liddy's come up with. This is enmeshed. He says to Mitchell, he says, this has to be a special operation group. And he says, maybe you know it by its original Germanic name, Mr. Mitchell, Einsatzgruppe, which is the group that machine gunned Jews to death riding ahead on motorcycles to kill them.
God.
No. But this is how he's speaking, Eric, in all his terminology and through his writings and his diary. This is not just a guy who liked the tank movements of Rommel. This is a guy oh, yes, my friend. It's far deeper than anyone ever imagined. And that's why when I was a kid growing up and this Watergate thing was happening, it caught my ear from the Germanic connection to everything. That's what scared the living crap out of me when I was 18 years of age. Not so much the politics of it. See, I now believe in retrospect that this is all a derivation of Operation Paperclip. As I've said to you many times, I believe that with the Galen organization coming into the United States through Operation Paperclip and hundreds of these other Nazi war criminals, this had an effect on the American culture. And I think it had an effect on guys like G. Gordon Liddy. I mean, here is a guy who's speaking in Germanic terms, speaking in Nazi lingo, talking openly, laughingly about the Nazis. And I'm going like, it's insane. Okay. So you think to yourself, what could this possibly have? It doesn't mean they hired the Nazis to do their bidding, but we now know that Nazis and former war criminals were involved in all kinds of things, not just to point the finger at on Werner von Braun, Eric. I mean, think about the people who are in this cabinet. Think about the people who worked for Nixon. Okay, I'm going to read you some names. You ready? You ready for these names?
Yeah.
Okay, these are just the names, and I haven't thought about this since I was like 18 or 19 years of age. But this is what hooked me on the story from the beginning. I'm going to read you the names of people surrounding the president. Ehrlichman, Haldeman, Ziegler, Kleindienst, Schlesinger, Schultz, Kissinger. Every one of the people around him was of Germanic heritage. I mean, what are the odds of that? It's insane. It's absolutely insane. Every single one of these guys came from Germanic roots. And they laughed and talked about the Nazi subculture when they were out drinking, when they were doing stuff like these plans. This is what they laughed about. And I'm telling you something, this was the closest we came to Operation Paperclip taking over the United States of America with its descendants. And now we're experiencing, as I've said in numerous shows, the same thing is happening where the former Soviet communists, when the Soviet Union collapsed, infiltrated into the United States and into, I believe, the Democratic Party, and have now influenced the leftist version of the Democratic Party, and have made Russia their arch enemy, which is a subject for many shows. But let me just tell you what Gemstone involved, because it involved a multitude of programs that Liddy presented. One of them was Quartz, which was the microwave interrogation using microwave interception of telephones. Another one was Emerald, Emerald is unbelievable. Emerald is using a spy plane to follow planes with Democratic candidates on it to eavesdrop in midair. I just think about that one. Okay, that's Emerald. Ruby was the infiltration, Operation Ruby is the infiltration of the Democratic candidates' offices. Operation Cole, CO as Cole, was funding Shirley Chisholm, the congresswoman from Brooklyn, to run for president, so she would have to be attacked by Democratic people to stop her from proceeding. In other words, taking money and running it into Shirley Chisholm's Brooklyn presidential coffers, right? This was Operation Cole because she was black, right?
Oh, God.
I know. Right. There is Operation Diamond. Operation Diamond is one of my favorites, Eric. This involves drugging and kidnapping members of the Weather Underground on the left who are going to disrupt the Republican convention, and taking them to Mexico and holding them for as long as the convention lasted, the Republican convention that was going to go on. Then there was Operation Topaz, which was the photographs of documents, breaking into safes and photographing documents. Operation Turquoise they always use the Cubans out of Miami, by the way, and that'll come to play in the Watergate story. The Cubans were their foot soldiers, and the Cubans infiltrated the United States when their country was overthrown, just like the collapse of Germany, just like the collapse of the Soviet Empire. The Cubans were used by these people as foot soldiers. So what was the plan of Operation Turquoise? That was to destroy the air conditioning systems at the Democratic Convention, so it would be 115 degrees inside the Miami Convention Center. While they were fighting among themselves, the Democrats would then be sweating profusely and not be able to fix the air conditioning in time. That was Operation Turquoise. So he begins to show these programs to Mitchell in Mitchell's office. And he shows this, and Mitchell just goes, "Dear God, this is insane, Liddy," right? But it's not that he's opposed to the programs. These are conservative money people who have taken over the Republican Party. And Mitchell simply says, "This is too expensive." So it's not horrified.
We can't afford it.
We can't afford it. So Liddy leaves with Dean and Magruder, and he starts screaming at them, saying, "You told me money was no option." So they're embarrassed, and he says, "All right, you got to cut it down to $500,000." Now I don't know what $500,000 is in 1971 terms, but it's a substantial amount of money. So he begins to pare down the program. So he comes up with these other ideas. One of the ideas is to break into the psychiatrist files in Beverly Hills of a guy named Daniel Ellsberg. Now, who is Daniel Ellsberg? He releases the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times. Daniel Ellsberg works at the Rand Corporation and comes upon the Pentagon Papers, photostats them, and begins to turn them over to the New York Times, running around the country while hiding from the FBI. So he now decides to break into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist, a guy named Fielding, Dr. Fielding, and they break in. And one of the things about Liddy is it's too much cloak and dagger, Eric. It's too much. They overdo everything. They get special guns. They get special cameras that don't work. They get different tape recorders. It's overkill. Everything Liddy does. And he's not a buffoon. It's just like he's too big for the room. He should have been CIA, but he wasn't. He was kind of just like a small town cop, an FBI grunt, like you were saying, right? Mm-hmm. So, but to the Nixon people, they're all Ivy League, tassel shoes guys. So Liddy, to them, is as close to as they're going to get, except Liddy's got one friend in the program, and that's E. Howard Hunt, who is CIA. Liddy and Hunt form a team. That's the Plumbers unit. And Hunt becomes the vessel to bring the Cubans in. Liddy doesn't know the Cubans. Hunt knows the Cubans. That includes Bernard Barker. That includes Frank Sturgis. That includes all of these guys that Hunt claims he's used on other black bag jobs. So these guys now decide to do these different jobs. And one of them is to begin to they're obsessed with LSD, as you're well aware. So and they never understand how this doesn't work. And as you and I have seen through 100 attempts to kill Castro, 50 of them involved LSD most of the time with Sidney Gottlieb. So what is one of the things they're going to do? They're going to put LSD on the wheel of the car of Daniel Ellsberg as he's driving to some Democratic fundraising function. So he will get high on LSD and make a fool of himself while he's speaking. They never, ever think that maybe a guy on LSD might just say, no, I can't speak. I'm too high. You know what I mean? It's always, it's always the same. Every one of the times I read these plots in CIA documents that have been declassified, it's always the same stupidity. We're going to dose him with acid. He's going to then do in front of people. And there's never an explanation that maybe he'll just throw up or go in the bathroom and say, I'm too sick to go on. You know what I mean? It's so funny.
Wile E. Coyote.
It's Wile E. Coyote. Yeah, it's Wile E. Coyote.
And there's your filing cabinet.
That's the actual filing cabinet the Cubans broke into in Beverly Hills, in an apartment building, by the way. So this is leading up. By the way, Operation Crystal, just to get back to one more gemstone, which was my favorite, was getting a houseboat across from the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami during the Democratic Convention and putting prostitutes on it, wiring it, luring in McGovern, Muskie, and all these guys, and then having dirt on them during the convention. In other words, having a honeypot trap, like we talked about, honey trap thing. And there's a guy, they contact Liddy because a guy shoots George Wallace in the stomach, and his name is Arthur Bremen. He's from Milwaukee. So Dean and Magruder want Liddy to go to his apartment and throw around McGovern literature around the apartment, right? And this is what they came up with. This is the knuckleheads came up with this. So Liddy has the presence of mind to ask them, where did you find out about Bremer? Because it was just happening. And he says, we found out from the FBI. And he says, I can assure you that the FBI has already been through his apartment if they're letting you know that he lives in Milwaukee in an apartment. And for me to go in there now with literature is going to be a highly dangerous operation. So he, on occasion, talks them out of crazy crap. Eric, you know what I mean? Like he's able to say, look, there's the whole group. That becomes the whole group there. So anyway, so this group begins to form, and this leads to the break-in, not the break-in, the final break-in. There's an earlier break-in of the Watergate a month before, which is a National Democratic headquarters. And what they want to do, and this is, if I could make this clear today, the administration under Nixon was the Biden administration back then, if that makes any sense to anybody. They were projecting what the other side was going to do to them. They were projecting that the other side had all this dirt on them. They were projecting all this stuff. Nixon did not have to do any of this stuff. He was light years ahead in the polls against McGovern, 1,000,000 points ahead. He won the election by the biggest landslide in American history. It was complete overkill what he did. The corruption in the Nixon administration was completely unnecessary. The political corruption. I don't know there was any financial corruption. This political stuff was because the country was out of control. There were bombings and there was all kinds of riots going on.
Crime was a nightmare.
Right. But the silent majority voted to give Nixon, this re-election in 72, And all of this that led to his impeachment was unnecessary. That's the irony, Eric. It was not a close race. You could see them doing this if the election was tight. It was never tight. And
didn't he win like 49 out of 50 states?
Yes. And what did that do to the Democrats? It infuriated them. It was overkill. There was no need to do this. He won by a landslide, but he had done this the previous year. So once it begins to leak out, once Liddy and Hunt begin to plan, the first episode is successful. They're now told to go back for a second time. And why are they told to go back? It's because Magruder and Dean believe that they have dirt on Republican candidates. They didn't. They didn't do what these guys did. There was no Democratic Plumbers unit. Now, years later, the tide will switch and they will begin to mimic what the Nixonian people did. But at this time, they were doing, as Barnes says, projection through confession, right?
Yep.
Or confession through projection, rather.
Yeah, I see it that way.
The other way around. And they sent in Liddy and Hunt to go back into the National Democratic headquarters of Larry O'Brien to find out what they had in that desk. And they sent in the Cubans with all kinds of fancy equipment that was way over the Cubans' heads. There's Frank Sturgis in the middle. And everybody thinks Frank Sturgis was a big deal. He was not a big deal. This was another low-level operator like Barker on James McCord. Now, James McCord is the one who's going to blow the whistle on everybody. James McCord is sent to jail by Judge Sirica, and he does buckle. Now, to Liddy, it's Barker on the extreme right. Liddy and Hunt are in a hotel room across the street, and they're in there monitoring the conversation as these guys go in there, and they put like white tape to hold open the door, and the guard sees the white tape and he takes it off, and they're told by the Watergate burglars that the guard removed the white tape, and Hunt wants to abort the mission, but Liddy says no, put more white tape to hold the door open. And that white tape sealed their fate, because the same guard comes back around again later that morning. This is 2:00 in the morning. I think it's June 17th and in 1971. And that guard comes back around again and sees the new tape. So bad. So anyway, that's why he calls the police, the black guard, and they're all arrested. But I just want to point something out to you. One of the great quotes to make the case of the comparison between Trump and Nixon. One of the great quotes, he doesn't know this when he makes this quote, Liddy, but he talks about, quote, the psychotic Nixon hate would run out of fuel eventually. He says this quote, not knowing that there was going to be a similar thing years later. And he talks about almost exactly Trump derangement syndrome. He says, the anti-Nixon bias on the left is visceral, not rational. Now, what does that sound like, Eric?
Mm-hmm.
That's what he had stumbled onto. And they do the same thing with Bush, and they do the same thing with Trump years later. And he says this, Liddy, not knowing this is years and years ago. He says this during the time period. But now these guys are arrested, and Hunt and Liddy abandon ship. They take their equipment and they get in the car and they drive away. And they realize they've got about 12 hours to come up with a storyline to cover this up, because they're going to find out who these guys are once they get booked, Eric.
Mm.
He goes home, takes off his clothes, goes to get into bed with his wife, and she says, how was work today? He goes, it didn't go well. I think I'm going to jail tomorrow.
That's what we opened with.
Oh, yeah, that's where that comes from. Right, that's where that comes from. And that's Liddy personified. That really is Liddy. He says, I think I'm going to go to jail, move over, wakes up the next day, 5:00 in the morning, gets a phone call from me, Howard Hunt, saying we need money for bail, and it's on. The whole cover-up is on. And Hunt will later shake down the president for money. Hunt's wife will later die in a mysterious plane crash with the money. But we're focusing on Liddy today. Hunt will have his own day in the sun in another storyline. But today is Liddy Day. And Liddy refuses to cooperate with anybody. And this becomes Liddy's badge of honor. Everybody, to some degree, begins to cooperate. They don't really spill their guts, but it's piece by piece. Some of them didn't. But you're talking about, just so people at home who don't understand the scope of Watergate, this is not a small scandal. 69 people in the administration were indicted. 48 were convicted. I mean, think about that in a presidential group. Think about that number.
Wow.
Right. Okay. So the FBI, as we now know, without getting into the weeds of Watergate, which would take too long, the FBI, Nixon has the CIA contact the FBI to try to head them off on the investigation. And it works for a couple of weeks. But there's a guy who's dead, and that's J. Edgar Hoover. And they would have needed J. Edgar Hoover at this point. There's a guy named L. Patrick Gray. L. Patrick Gray was Nixon's own man. And he had been compromised. They gave him documents to destroy. And in those documents, having nothing to do with Watergate, they were the sex life of Ted Kennedy and phony, this is really weird, phony telegrams that were doctored up that the DM brothers' assassination in Vietnam was ordered by JFK. That's weird. So they tell Gray to get rid of these. Now, Gray replaces Clyde Tolson, who becomes the head of the FBI for literally a couple of weeks after the death of his lover and manservant, J. Edgar Hoover. So Tolson is replaced by L. Patrick Gray. L. Patrick Gray will never get confirmed by the United States Senate because of what he did. He will never get confirmed. So he's acting director of the CIA. And as acting director of the FBI, rather, as acting director of the FBI, he has a number 2 man. And he assigns the bulk of the investigation to his number 2 man, who is an alcoholic, who is thoroughly embittered. And his name is Mark Felt. And you people know him as at home as Deep Throat. This weasel here is so embittered that he could care less about the politics of Watergate. He's a total alcoholic with a huge temper, and he's one of the people I described to you earlier, who is from the deep administrative state, and he felt that he should have been director of the FBI. And because of that, he begins leaking the investigation to two guys named Woodward and Bernstein. And that's where Watergate becomes all the president's men. Now, Woodward, to his credit, goes to the bail hearing and begins to hear these names as depicted in the movie and begins to connect the dots. And these dots that are being connected are legitimate by Woodward, but they never, Eric, in a million years, would have broken this case without Mark Felt as Deep Throat. Ever.
Nope.
Now, how do we know this? Because L. Patrick Gray is told on 5 occasions by John Mitchell and members of the Nixon administration to fire Mark Felt. They know he's Deep Throat. The Nixon administration knows he's Deep Throat. And why do they know that? Because they get a call from an obscure guy named Roswell Gilpatrick, a Democrat who was a straight shooter. Roswell Gilpatrick calls up John Mitchell and says, the guy leaking it is Mark Felt. Now, Roswell Gilpatrick was Deputy Secretary of Defense under JFK. He helped negotiate the end to the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was the legal counsel for Time magazine at this point, but found out that through the writers at Time magazine that Mark Felt was the source. And he felt it was his patriotic duty. This is a guy from the other party, a Democrat, Eric, who had served under JFK, to contact the Nixon administration to tell them that Mark Felt was the source of Deep Throat information from the FBI. And L. Patrick Gray, on his deathbed in 1990, at the age of 93, when he was about to die, said in this final interview, which you can read online, said that he was the only one in the country who did not believe at the very end, even until he comes out, when Mark Felt comes out. And remember when Felt came out and said,
yeah,
okay, that's when L. Patrick Gray finally says, oh, dear God, I was duped.
Jeez.
The only schmuck in the country who did not believe this was L. Patrick Gray. And he admits that on 5 occasions he was contacted by the Nixon administration, told to get rid of this guy, and he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. And that leads to the whole mess of Watergate because of what's going to happen with G. Gordon Liddy. Now, Liddy refuses to buckle. He hires his friend as an attorney, a top criminal attorney, and he says, I want you to defend me. And he says, but we're going to lose intentionally. And he goes, what do you mean? He says, I am never going to defend myself in this case. I'm taking the rap. And the rap from Sirica is 20 years for a burglary, a white-collar crime, having no criminal record, with a pristine background. Sirica, who Liddy says was mentally insane, by the way. Liddy says that Sirica was megalomaniacally insane and said to him he's going to make an example out of Liddy by sentencing him to 20 years so the others would buckle, right? And this is not untrue, what Liddy is saying. The 20-year sentence was completely deranged sentence for who Liddy was and what his crimes were. It should have been 36 months, Eric. You know what I mean? The thing had become so politicized that they had to make an example out of Liddy. And he's being put in the D.C. County Jail, which he describes, which is where the same people today from January 6th are living their lives that Liddy lived, with thousands of cockroaches on his face, rats eating him at night, no blanket, no nothing, complete disaster zone, even in 1971 and 72, when he was in the D.C. jail. Because the case is going on, they bring him back and forth from the D.C. jail because of the court case. He's eventually sentenced to the federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut, which is spotless, because it's a federal prison, Eric. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Okay. I don't even know how to explain this, but in the federal prison, Liddy begins to form an intelligence organization, just like the Gehlen organization of the Nazi Gestapo. Okay. He becomes the advisor legally to all the prisoners, and he becomes the legal advisor to all their cases, and then he owns them. So with all their jobs that they have in the prison, it's funneled back to G. Gordon Liddy, who now takes over the prison because he's got dirt on the warden, the guards, and every single group. He turns his operation into a Gestapo intelligence organization at the Danbury prison. And this is, to me, the most fascinating part of the Liddy story, because Liddy is respected by all the prisoners wherever he goes as the man who wouldn't rat. And he explains in his great autobiography, Will, that the lowest man on the totem pole in any prison culture is the rat. And Liddy is revered by all prisoners wherever he goes as not only not ratting, but to be the most highest level person, second in command to the president, and not rat. In other words, it's a percentage. You know, it's one thing to, you know, not to rat on your teacher in school, but
Sure.
to not to rat on the president and to take a 20-year sentence. They come up to him in every prison he's in going, you're the man, ain't you? And they're all black, by the way. And at first, you know, he's hassled racially, but that flips. He's then revered by the prisoners as the man. So he begins to help them with their cases legally, Eric. And it works. It works. They get sentence reductions, all this stuff. He begins to do their cases in prison. So he then is treated badly by the warden and his administration and the guards in Danbury, Connecticut. And he says, all right, I got to go on the offensive here in this prison. So he sees that prisoners are going in and out of the warden's office with telephone equipment. Like, in other words, every single thing in the prison is run by the prisoners. The electrical system, the garbage, you know, like a lot of this stuff. So this is unbelievable. He gets through his operations, he wiretaps the warden's office. And he begins to listen and eavesdrop to the warden's chicanery, having nothing to do with him. Right. Stealing money, how the warden is siphoning off different products to his own house, how the warden is doing all this illegal stuff. he confronts the warden and sues the warden in federal court and wins. Then he doesn't stop there. He begins to get better treatment for the men. He begins to use his intelligence organization to become a kingpin in the federal prison. And of course, eventually this becomes an embarrassment to the prison, which is why I believe Jimmy Carter commuted his sentence after 4.5 years. Jimmy Carter did not wake up one day. They wanted Liddy out of the prison system. He had made a mockery of them. And he was starting to be transferred around. He ends up in Terminal Island here in California, and he's taking like creative writing classes with screenwriters who had embezzled money, who were sent to prison here in California. And he begins to become a problem for prison authorities, Eric.
You know, I was thinking this right when you were talking about it. Sounds like the Shawshank Redemption.
In a lot of ways it is. In a lot of ways it is. By the way, they wanted to put acid in Daniel Ellsberg's soup as he sat on the dais of a Democratic fundraiser. So he eat the soup and begin tripping on acid. That was another one they did with the acid. I mean, they're just obsessed with acid, crazy stuff. But getting back to Liddy in prison, he then gets paroled, commuted, gets out after 4.5, and begins to piece his life back together, which leads to this show business career. It leads to the radio, conservative radio, where he does an incredible job. It leads to this tour of Liddy and Leary going on the road together. It leads to appearances that are hysterically funny on the late night TV. You see Liddy with Letterman. The Letterman one's brilliant. And he talks about the fact that I have to stay close to Leary because he keeps coming up with new drugs that aren't illegal yet. And if I let him get away with it, these drugs will never be known to me or law enforcement. He's half joking, of course, but he develops a fond relationship with Timothy Leary. And I knew Leary here in Hollywood at the end of his life. So, I mean, Leary has a quality that's very lovable at this time. And he's kind of like a leprechaun. You know what I mean? He's kind of like this Irish, impish character, Leary. He's a very lovable guy, but also a rat. So I don't know how Liddy just hated rats. Yeah, here he is with his Watergate license plate. Liddy said that he used informants his whole life. And even though they helped him in the FBI, they helped him in assistant DA, he reviled them. And in Liddy's life, the lowest form of life, which he then adapted in the prison culture, was the informant or the rat. And he said, no matter what happened, I could never be that guy. And that's
a mafioso vibe.
Right. He said the highest level in the prison hierarchy was the mafioso. And he said that's because they did crime and had an oath and were not guys who just knocked over a liquor store with a gun. Those are the middle guys. The guys on top of the hierarchy in prison were the mafiosos, he said.
Wow. Insane.
I mean, it's an amazing story. So again, is he a hero? I don't know. Is he a villain? I don't know. He's both at different times.
Is he interesting? Hell yeah.
Oh, dude, he's an American untold story, without a doubt. I mean, he's one of the most fascinating Americans that we've ever had because he's stuck in the middle politically, and he served his country and he did all this stuff and he raised a perfectly great family. But if I could sum this up in one phrase, and I really can't, but these guys who were doing this work in the Plumbers unit were Nazis on a budget because constantly it's not political, it's budgetary. And I just found this to be incredibly funny, but it makes sense. The Democrats would have just simply tapped into George Soros and said, we need $2 billion to teach, all this crazy stuff in school. The Republicans who were worried about spending were constantly saying, oh, no, we could get the reason they don't do the houseboat was too expensive. The rental of the houseboat with the whores on it. They love the ideas. It wasn't about the ideas. It was just too expensive. We're on a budget, and I found that to be Nazis on a budget, which I found to be funny.
Crazy. Wow.
But man, is he fun to read about and fun to look at. And, his document about the removal of J. Hoover, if they would have listened to him, it would have head off this incredible thing. Now, I just want to add one more thing that Liddy talks about. He says if they were doing an operation breaking into a safe at the FBI or an intelligence, and Hunt talked about this too. Let's say there were 6 people working in the office, Eric. They would trail the 6 people with 6 agents to make sure they never doubled back, if that makes any sense to you. It wasn't just going in and breaking a safe. They would have 5 agents on the 5 people who work there, even if it was their day off. They would monitor the 5 people who worked in that office. And if they had to, if a person left the office and they said, go, it's green, they would have a guy monitoring that person from the office on the street to make sure he didn't say, oh, Jesus, I forgot my wallet, and double back, right? Okay. If the person doubled back, the agent in charge of monitoring them was authorized to disrupt them by doing a phony mugging or actually killing them. And this was in D.C. I'm talking about in D.C., like a phony mugging or killing them or a phony robbery and knocking them unconscious. And he said this in 1971. He wrote this, Liddy, about how to break into a safe and how to break into the Watergate. And you know what came to my mind, Eric? A guy who worked at DNC headquarters.
Seth Rich.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's what happened to Seth Rich. I think he went to go back. He had a couple of drinks and was going to go back to the office. He'd already downloaded what he downloaded onto the thumb drive, the emails, the Hillary Clinton emails. And he went to double back, and they were already breaking in and taking the servers or whatever they were doing in there. And I think they killed him and made it look like a robbery. And it just, once I read what he had written, it just came to mind. It just came. I just want to put that out there for anybody who's interested in the Seth Rich case, because something was not right with that case. Something was not right. And look what it led to. You know,
we got one more to cover. Terry Nee brought up, because G Gordon Liddy's famous for his candle.
Right, but he did this through his whole life. It's not a question of the candle. He did this like 20 times. He did it since he was 7 years old.
Right. Well, no, I mean, you didn't describe it, I believe, in that.
Because there are multiple versions of how he did it. In other words, a black guy tried to beat the living crap out of him in prison. He took a bunch of matches and gave it to the guy and had the guy hold the matches under his forearm, because his hand had been so destroyed already by doing the candle thing that he now melted the flesh on his forearm in prison to do the same effect that he had started when he was 7 years old. The original version was picking up a hot coal from a fire and holding it in his hand. That was the original candle. The candle is just a metaphor. It's just a metaphor, because he did this in various fire ways, from coal, charcoal, to matches, to candle, if that helps anybody.
Wow.
Yeah.
What a badass.
On numerous occasions.
What a psycho.
Yep, that's right.
Well, guess what? We have 305 people watching us on Rumble right now, and we have some Rumble rants.
Oh, cool. That's cool.
So,
I hope you like the story, because it's a great story.
Oh, yeah. And then I love that, how he became, a radio star, hung out with Letterman, a pop culture figure.
Like I said, right. If we'll post this on Locals, Eric and I. There's stuff that the radio show we're going to post on Locals. The William F. Buckley firing line one is really riveting, because when Buckley is arguing with him about his morality of not being a rat, and Buckley doesn't see it as a rat. Buckley sees it as cooperating with law enforcement, that he reveres Buckley. And it's fascinating philosophical discussion, which we'll put on Locals, unstructured.locals.com.
That's the one. And just for you, Mark, to make sure that we have that.
Whoop, 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 whoop. Do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do.
All right. On Rumble, Krabby T. Girth send us a $10 Rumble rant. Hello, gentlemen. Looks like I'm fashionably late again.
What?
Yeah. T. Gaggiotti. This is already the best episode yet. And that was really early in.
Wow.
And then Krabby T. Girth again with $10. I love you guys. Both sharp as a tack.
Right.
The way my memory is, I can hide my own Easter eggs.
That's interesting.
And then T. Gaggiotti comes back again with $11. I like this back and forth.
This
This gets better and better. And
let me just add one more. I mean, there's so many great Liddy anecdotes. It's hard. I'm sorry, but Jack Anderson was the Julian Assange of the Washington Post, and he was leaking all kinds of stuff that was given to him by Daniel Ellsberg. And they said, we got to get rid of Jack Anderson. And he was a huge name, a huge journalist at the Washington Post. So Liddy, they said, we'll do the LSD thing. And Liddy says, fuck it. Why don't we just shoot him in the head? And they all look at him and go, okay. He goes, all right. And he gets his, his silencer and his CIA gun. And he says, just give me the green light. I'm ready to go. He never gets the green light to kill Jack Anderson, but he justifies it in writing, saying, I would have killed him. And he says it was war. It was a civil war. Anyway, I just wanted to add that.
Wow. Insane.
Yeah.
All right. Some super chats here. We all have our crazy phobias. Not sure what we were talking about at that point. Oh, early on. It was a list of his. That's right.
Yeah.
I love the scene in Nixon where Nixon and Haldeman agree that Liddy is a fruitcake and a nut.
Right. That's a little over the top by Oliver. But there is some truth to them doing that. But it was almost like the pit bull they needed, Eric.
Yeah, he was like their Patton.
Right. That could be true.
Super sticker. Thank you very much, Peter. That's a hell of a super sticker. Glenn Go-Go.
Glenn Go-Go?
Well, Glenn Go. Met and recorded him in Brisbane, Australia in the 80s.
Wow.
That's pretty cool.
Wow.
Hontus Farmer. Thanks for your content. Appreciate your work. Thank you, Hontus. Paul D. Bryant. Keep up the fantastic work, guys. We got Pasha is back.
Pasha?
No, I just expected the answer.
Yeah, I don't know what the answer is, but the Yiddish word
yes.
The Yiddish word of the day, Pasha, is Kenahara. And Pasha knows what that means. So we'll leave it for Pasha's. Kenahara, it just reminded me. Hero villain, yes. Yeah, that's true.
Okay. Still waiting for a deep dive into Mary Meyer, Cord Meyer, Angleton, and yes, Tim Leary with the JFK assassination.
Going to wait a long time because the Mary Meyer book is written by a CIA agent, but you seem to think that it's the 100% truth written by a CIA agent. So it may not be true. But she did have an affair with JFK, but that's being said. A lot of people think that she was killed by the CIA, which may be true. I mean, she was divorced.
I think Liddy was brilliant and king of machismo. Yeah, maybe.
Okay, well, his career, I mean, it starts out with Miami Vice, by the way, with Michael Mann, the TV show.
Yeah, I found a clip on that.
Yeah. I mean, people forget he started out playing a bad guy. Loved the
a drug lord.
The radio show was great, Mark. It really was a good radio show. Right. I don't know what else. The radio show I loved. Mark Albert Einstein wants his hair back. I'm sorry, I don't understand that. That was one of the hippest conversations we've ever had, whoever that was.
Yeah.
That was brilliant.
It was brilliant.
Yeah. It's funny because Albert Brooks is real
Einstein.
What's that?
Yeah, Albert Brooks is Albert Einstein.
Right. So is he referring to Albert Brooks?
Could be.
Right.
Could be Bob and Albert Einstein.
Richard Lewis told me this story. A bee's nest outside his kitchen window exploded, and all the bees were in his kitchen stinging him. And the phone rings, and he's called 911 already, and it's Albert Brooks. And he says, "Let's have lunch at Greenblatt's." And he says to Albert Brooks, "I can't. I'm being stung by hundreds of bees." So Albert Brooks, without skipping a beat, says, "Throw a quart of honey on your roof and meet me at Greenblatt's in 20 minutes."
Wow.
It's a great line of all time.
Wow, Rockweed Girl. I used to think G. Gordon Liddy was a German guy chopped up by the airplane prop in the first Indiana Jones for a long time.
Oh, that's funny. That's funny. And she's not into weed, by the way. She does something with rocks up in New Hampshire or Maine. Maine, rather, by Acadia National Park, I think, if I recall.
Crazy.
I thought she was like somebody hitting the bong, but not really.
Well, you know who doesn't believe in bongs or drugs?
Who's on the Natch? Right. Oh, yeah. Oswald's on the Natch. Patsy the dog?
That's right.
Oswald the dog?
Oswald, the Patsy.
Oswald. Right.
Oswald the dog. He's a Patsy. You can find him and other merch, and there's a link below. You could support Mark via PayPal or Venmo We'll get you on Cash App someday.
Yeah, someday I'm going to get Cash App. A lot of girls I know use Cash App. What a great show. I think it means, right, Pasha, to ward off the evil eye. Am I crazy about it? I think that's what Kanahara means. Yeah, that you should ward off, I think, the evil eye or evil spirits. I don't know about the evil eye, but
I'll take both your words for it.
yeah. Now this thing, it seems like to be working, Eric. This subscription thing.
Yeah, we're getting a few trickling in here and there. Please tell your friend. Please subscribe if you haven't already.
Who should I tell?
You could tell everybody, Mark.
Oh, right. I see.
They can tell everybody too. I'm speaking.
Right. Okay. Right. Well, I think it's having an effect because it looks like the needle's moving inch by. I mean, I'll be 150 years old if we ever hit 50,000 by then. The way this thing is moving, but I'm not going to quit because I trust the people will eventually. Just like one day we'll get like 10,000. Oh, you know what I heard was the people on Bolsonaro's election team in Brazil after the Twitter was freed, all of a sudden went from 5,000 followers back to their original 250,000 followers overnight as soon as the election was over.
Very nice, bro.
Yeah. We'll discuss that on Friday with a strange man named Robert Barnes. We're going to see how Barnes handles this on Friday, on Freeform Friday with Robert Barnes.
We'll unleash the Barnes.
Unleash the Barnes on Friday with all kinds of questions that haunt me during the week. To me, it's really getting my own crazy crap answered by Barnes that haunt me. You know,
to me, it's just
right. Well, it could be fun. It could be fun too.
I'm like a cat watching a laser.
Yeah, it could be fun. It could be fun. But he's got to come up with some answers because these questions are building up, Kanahara.
Well, we better get to the questions. Everybody check us out on Locals, and we will see you on Friday.
Oh, that's it. Okay, see you later. Thanks for stopping by.